All right, and welcome back to our second lecture on this idea of creativity. I want to come back to this idea of programs and practices for a second. I'm hoping that you'll find this helpful. But let me start again by talking about this gap sentence, right? Because our teenagers are feel something, we will innovate something in order that young people might believe or discover something. Think about what this does, this sort of sentence does for you when people are like, well, why are you like doing that with young people? You can literally explain to them. This is like an educational sentence. We've discovered that young people feel or believe this. And we want them to know that what we think Jesus is telling them is this. And so the work that we're doing, and we're trying to help young people be invited into the Jesus-centered narrative, is that we're innovating and implementing this, right? All of a sudden, the gap sentence can make sense to somebody. You know what normally happens? There is no current narrative, there is no Jesus narrative, and there's just random ideas. This is why people come up to you and say, back when I was in youth group and we had this band come in, it changed my life. I think you should do that. Or, we took everybody to this camp, and like my older kids love this camp. And if you only did that camp again, I bet you that would help. You see what people are doing? They're giving you these random ideas to somehow solve a problem, but we don't know really what the problem is because there isn't a current narrative and there isn't a Jesus-centered narrative. It's more Jesus activity that we're trying to try things just to kind of keep young people around so they don't, I suppose, get in trouble, right? Now, I'm not saying that people giving advice is bad, but I think sometimes we don't know what to do with that advice. And so we're like, oh, that's really great. Oh, yeah, I'll look into that. Or, oh my gosh, that's a good idea. Let me look into it, right? We can get distracted because not only there are so many issues that young people are going through that we're trying to like address, we've got people giving us advice, and now we don't want to let them down or like not take them seriously. So then we're holding that as well. So we've got all this stuff, but we've got no direction. The gap sentence says, no, this is what my students are saying. This is where I think Jesus wants us to go, and this is the work that we're going to do to get there, right? So you can then say to people, they're like, oh, I'm thinking you should do this. You can say, that's a great idea, but help me think about this for a second. This is what young people are saying. This is where we think Jesus is calling people to go. How do you think what you're suggesting actually helps with that? You see what you're doing? You're forcing people to look in the gap between the current narrative and the Jesus-centered narrative, because that's where young people say they need us the most, right? Makes all the difference. Will change your life, I guarantee it, right? So creativity requires that we bridge the gap, and then we come up with what we called having purposeful programs and portable practices. Now you're going to be like, wait a minute, Steve, you just like railed on programs in that last lecture. Like, why are you bringing up programs again? Because the reality is that programs aren't all bad. Random programs are bad. Lots of historical programs that we've done forever are probably not helpful. But our programs can be purposeful. And so we have to ask ourselves different questions about the programs that we do and the practices that we want to bring about. So when I think about purposeful programs, I think about this. How do our programs invite young people to experience Jesus-centered narratives? I believe the programs can do that if we're intentional about them. And so here's just an example of maybe something to think about as you map out your programs in your ministry. Let's go back to this idea of the current narrative of where to be average is to be invisible for a second. And let's say we have these types of programs sort of down this left-hand column here of things that potentially you do. You don't necessarily have to do all of them. That's not the point, right? And then as we think about them, how might these narratives be impacting their identity, belonging, and purpose? And how do we call them to a better Jesus narrative where I count, I'm seen, I matter, right? Perhaps it helps us to reflect on their identity and how we use our Sunday classes, right? What if in our Sunday classes we committed to acknowledge every person and to invite them to contribute? Why? Because they matter and they count and their voice matters, right? Or maybe the mentoring that we invite adults to do with young people. We train mentors to see and support young people. Like we say that seeing them is really, really crucial, okay? However you do that is fine, but you see the point. or the arts. We will create varied and multiple forms of expression. So every type of student has the opportunity to express themselves, right? Or belonging, if I'm not seen, I might feel like I belong, right? But if there's a Jesus-centered narrative where you are seen, maybe in the midweek gathering, like let's say your group meets on Wednesdays or Tuesdays or Thursdays or whatever, we will greet every person and reach out to the absent to tell them they were missed, right? Not as a way to shame them, but to kind of say, we noticed you weren't here and our group isn't the same without you, right? That points them to the Jesus-centered narrative. Or weekend service. We will tell average stories, not fantastical ones, right? Wouldn't that be great? Like, what if the stories we're told were never like, and then everything changed and I was great? What if it was more like, yeah, I made it through the day today? Like, I think that actually would communicate something to young people about what the gospel is and what the church is all about. Or online interaction. We'll create forms for dialogue for all voices, right? How might online be used for that? Or for purpose, we will show up at students' events because what they do matters, right? All of a sudden, these aren't just sort of random things that we're supposed to do as youth leaders or as mentors or as volunteers. These all of a sudden are purposeful programs that we are doing to bridge this gap and help students see and believe that the Jesus-centered invitation narrative is better. Okay, so I think that's the way we can use programs. I also think we can have portable practices. I really like this idea of portability, and here's why. I believe that there will be times in a young person's life when they will not show up at youth group or church event or church. There's a lot of different reasons for that. I talk a lot more about this in my emerging adult class. I don't think that them, quote unquote, leaving the church is always for the reasons that we assume. A lot of times it's just their life stage and development and a lot of other things going on. But I wonder if too often we are so dependent on programs that a young person is only supported if they show up or not. What if there is something about Christian practices that is quite lovely and that they're portable? Like if we teach young people practices, things that they can do and repeat and own, that they can take those anywhere. Like whether they show up at church or not doesn't mean they don't stop praying or finding community or reading the scriptures or practicing vocation or thinking about their calling, right? Like there are practices that can be embedded in their everyday living that they can keep doing, whether they show up at church or not, right? That seems like a win to me. And so, so I'm asking the question, how do our practices help young people try and practice living into the Jesus-centered narrative? And so let me just, I'm not going to give you a lot of particulars here, but I want to tell you what I mean by practices. And we learn this really through training our churches, because practices can be a bit elusive. We have a lot of different, based on our traditions, different ideas of what that means and everything else. But as we worked with churches to help them coach their students, we discovered a couple of things. And here's what we discovered. First of all, real quick, the practices that we worked with in our study were these 6: testimony, hospitality, vocation, lament, Sabbath, and justice. We categorize them by identity, belonging, purpose, but you can imagine that there's a little bit more of a blur here. You might be wondering why there isn't prayer here. It's because everybody does prayer, and we just wanted to offer some different ones. But we sort of limited the number of practices because it was part of our research project. We wanted to give leaders limited number of choices. It's not as overwhelming. And then it was also helpful for us because we were able to see and compare and contrast people that maybe chose the same practice, and we could learn from them through sort of this curated attempt. So there's more than these practices, but here's what we worked on. As we did these practices, we learned that practices are participatory, ongoing, personal, communal, embodied, and incremental. Okay, let me explain that. Practices are participatory. Young people must be engaged in the practice. In other words, they're doing something, not just learning about it. So we don't just learn about, I said we didn't use this one, but I'll just use it, prayer or testimony. We don't just learn about testimony. We actually practice testimony. And so there's something about it of inviting young people to actually participate in the practice that's really, really crucial for this. We also realize that practices need to be ongoing. Faith-forming habits require repetition and practice versus one-time events. So you don't like do testimony like one Wednesday night and kind of say, well, we've done it. Testimony is probably something that has to be done over a long period of time as people recognize the fact that they have to develop a habit with it rather than this being an episodic event. Practices are also personal and communal. So practices must invite the young person to personalize their experience and also to share it with others. So at some point, what happens with the practice is it has to be something that's meaningful to them, something that they make their own. And we saw this like with when we were doing like testimony, thinking about this idea of journaling. Like some people love journaling, other people just want to talk. That's fine. That's personalizing testimony in a way that's helpful to them. But what we also tried to do is then to say, well, no matter what form you use to talk about testimony, how do you like do it with others, right? And an example that we had is one church actually said, hey, I know you don't all journal, but we're going to try to do this. We're going to just take some time and you're going to journal in these journals that we got for you, but we're going to do it on a Wednesday night and we're going to all do it together, right? So there was something that was personal yet communal about that practice that was really, really helpful to students because they were in it together. But there was also a bit of individuality associated with it as well. Practices are embodied, right? So leaders default to instruct about the Christian faith must be counterbalanced with doing, trying, experiencing, and even failing. So part of a practice is, in essence, to practice. Like you don't get it right the first time. As a matter of fact, part of practicing is failing or being confused or not getting it or getting frustrated. So when we take it seriously and we embody these practices, we give room for the fact that people are becoming and that the goal isn't to get it perfect. The goal is to practice the practices. And then finally, and this was really important, we realized that practices need to be incremental. So practices, like any discipline, require gradual growing. Sharing, starting with small wins, can build deeper, more advanced practicing. So one church was like, hey, we're doing Sabbath. It's bridging the gap between the current narrative and the Jesus-centered narratives. And at first they're like, okay, so we're going to do a 24-hour retreat. Now, at first blush, that sounds great, right? Until you realize that most of these students and most of the adults haven't taken a Sabbath in a really, really long time. And they realized that they couldn't hold it for 24 hours. Like no one wanted to do this. Like they were scared. They didn't think they had the time. They were afraid, embarrassed. And so our leaders were brilliant. Taking into account all these other categories of practices, they said, okay, so we're going to practice Sabbath. You ready? For 1 minute. Okay? I'm just going to sit, be quiet, rest, think of something that you love. That's it. And then you can say to your students and your leaders, congratulations, you just practiced Sabbath. Small win, right? What did they do next time? 5 minutes. Small win. Next time, 10 minutes. Small win. Building up to the goal of a day-long retreat or whatever you're going to do. There's something really powerful about incrementalism in that I think it does inspire people to recognize the fact that they can actually do these things. But the mental models that we often have is that when it's too big or too overwhelming or too like mind-altering, is that they just don't know how to handle it. So this incremental step can make all the difference. Preachers are terrible at this. Like they're always on the stage telling us about all the wonderful things that we're supposed to do as Christians, how much money we're supposed to give away, how much time we're supposed to give, how we're supposed to give away our faith, how we're supposed to live perfectly. And like your average person in the pews are like, yeah, I'm not even close to that. Like I'm just trying to make it through the day. Like I'm just here to make sure that I love Jesus. Like, can you give me something that is a step rather than like making me like run a spiritual marathon every Sunday with your grandiose ideas of what I'm supposed to do? You know what I mean? Like we discourage people before they're even out of the gate. And then we blame them for not being motivated or committed enough or all those type of things. Like I just won't have it, man. Like, I just feel like we've got a better job to invite people into a compelling Jesus-centered narrative that starts with the first faithful step. In our church, we'd always talk about that. We'd ask the question, so what's for you the next faithful step? That's all you got to do. That's all that God's asking you to do. That's what it means to be faithful. And I think that can make all the difference. So how do we think about this? Well, let's go back to what we've been talking about these two lectures. What are the stories do young people tell themselves? That's your current narrative. What's the story Jesus wants to invite them into? That's the Jesus-centered narrative. And what program or practice can we innovate to acknowledge the concerns that encourages them to try Jesus' invitation, right? That's really where the good news is. I feel like if we take seriously this innovative gap sentence and we think about purposeful programs and this idea of portable practices, I think we can actually change the game. I think it raises new and really exciting ways for us to think about ministry that can really help young people. Now, let me just go meta on you for a second. You might be thinking about this going, there's no way I can change everything. There's no possible way that we've just done these last two lectures is going to help me at all, because I don't even know where to begin. I totally get it. Like, to change from a familiar way you're doing the ministry to this requires something even as level leaders as ourselves. But I bet there's one way that you can do this. But there's one way you can think about it. And it will require courage, but we'll hit that next week. So a little self-questions here. Just a couple of things to think about. Remember that creativity also needs limitations. Like, I just want to encourage you to use what you have. Like, if you think about a painting, like any sort of canvas, always has edges, which means you don't paint everything. You can only paint what's in a limited space. But it's in that limited space sometimes where the creativity really flows. When we have limitations, it actually evokes some of the best creativity. So I know a lot of churches that are like, well, we don't have like the huge youth room down the road. I don't think there's anything creative we can do. No, actually, you probably are in better shape to be creative because you have limited space and limited resources to do what you can do. So name what you have and work within the spaces that you are working into. That's all you need to do. And that's what you're called to be faithful in. Remember that creativity is directed toward bridging the gap. Stay focused. A lot of times what we found with leaders is that creativity can be super exciting, but then it begins to kind of expand in such a way that people get like really divergent in their thinking, which is really, really cool. But in the end of the day, you've got to come back to saying, what's the gap that we're trying to address? How do we focus our creativity in this space for this particular current narrative, Jesus-centered narrative? There'll be other opportunities for other things, but it helps us stay focused. Creativity invites collaboration that has to include others, as we talked about before. And I just think this sentence will not only focus you, but it'll be a great way for you to communicate to others what you're doing. You're actually discipling others by showing them what it means to talk about the current narrative, Jesus-centered narrative, and the work that we're trying to do in ministry. So I hope that is helpful to you. Lots to think about here. You can get more details in the book as well, but I hope that inspires your thinking. And so as you reflect on these things, as you think about your own ministry, as you think about your own experiences, may you be inspired by what it means to be a creative person with a creative team called to bridge the gap. And may you find joy in that, and may you know God's grace and peace.